There's never really a day when the BBC doesn't come under the spotlight in some shape or form. Do they have questions to answer on this one? And I guess there is another aspect of all of these kind of BBC-type stories. Do we blame... When something happens at the BBC, now this is the state broad, so the bar is correctly set higher than most. It's the state-funded broadcaster. And therefore, by dint of that definition and that fact, they are held perhaps to a higher account. Also being the state-funded broadcaster, it employs about 6 gazillion people. So when something kicks off over there at the BBC, do we blame the BBC or do we blame the individual? I mean, let's be honest, if Alex Jones on the One Show suddenly starts swearing like a navvy in the middle of interviewing the bloke from Boyzone, do we blame the BBC or do we blame Alex Jones? You hear what I'm saying here? And this is in kind of similar territory. Yesterday, and we played you the clip at the time, and we will play it again shortly. Nigel Farage accused the BBC of hypocrisy after a presenter questioned his relationship with Adolf Hitler. We'll listen to that in just a second. This was an interview on Radio 4, so it's their flagship programme. The presenter was a woman called Emma Barnett. I'll declare I used to work with Emma Barnett. I haven't seen her for a number of years, but a very diligent broadcaster. In fact, we've even played clips of Barnett previously when she's done a sterling job of tearing a new one of a certain politician or whoever it happens to be. But on this one, she got it horribly wrong. So there they are, the deputy leader of the Reform Party, Richard Tice, friend of this show, friend of mine, being interviewed by one of their top presenters, Emma Barnett. And of course, we already knew there was some contention around things that might have been said 50 years ago when Nigel Farage was at school. And it's with that backdrop that Emma Barnett decided to ask Richard Tice this.
Let's talk about your leader, Nigel Farage's relationship when he was younger with Hitler, shall we? Because 20 people told The Guardian... 20 people told The Guardian that Nigel Farage behaved in a racist and anti-Semitic way.
So could you just hear that first bit again, please?
Let's talk about your leader, Nigel Farage's relationship when he was younger with Hitler, shall we?
With Hitler? His relationship with Hitler. Now, that is called editorializing in the trade. That is not an objective question that you would pose, even taking into account the subject matter. Stuff apparently happened in the playground when Nigel Farage was at school, and some people, totally understandably, by the way, are not happy with that. But that is a BBC interviewer asking that question in the most loaded and mischievous manner. Let's just hear that bit again.
Let's talk about your leader, Nigel Farage's relationship when he was younger with Hitler, shall we?
With Hitler? His relationship with Hitler? Wow. I don't think I've heard Peter Mandelson or the likes being questioned quite so robustly about his relationship with a paedophile. Peter Mandelson, I should remind you, still sits in the House of Lords. 0344 499 1000. So you're familiar with the story, and I'm happy to get into this story as well, because there are some stories out there. If you've got a brain, you're able to wear more than one hat. And this is a classic example. So Nigel Farage faces allegations that he engaged in racist and anti-Semitic behaviour while he was a pupil at Dulwich College, which is a South London private school, very established and esteemed place of education it is. He's denied making any racist remarks after the asked about the interview at a press conference yesterday afternoon, and we brought this to you as it happened. The Reform leader said, "I cannot put up with double standards of the BBC about what I'm alleged to have said 49 years ago and what you are putting out on mainstream content." Now, this debate on that particular aspect, I want to talk about does the BBC have a question to answer on that specific point? But this debate is actually a lot about, and none of this, by the way, and I'm going to underline this and highlight it in big, bold, yellow pen, none of this undermines an individual's experience that is harrowing, disturbing, hurtful and horrendous that might have happened 5 years ago or 50 years ago. If you're on the receiving end of severe amounts of insults in whatever form it might be, for some kids that will stay with them. And when somebody says that, look, that's my experience, that's what happened to me, and there are people who've gone on TV explaining what happened to them, then I have an understanding and a sympathy, genuinely, how horrific that might be. And it doesn't matter what the reasoning is behind it, whether it is about the colour of your skin, whether it's about your religion, whether it's about your sexuality, whatever it happens to be. Stuff as a kid, I can think of a couple of things as a kid, of things that were said to me, not in this respect, that have always stuck with me. I don't live my life by them, they don't keep me awake at night, but once in a while you ponder, I remember when that was said, and it's still there. So if something fairly robustly and horrendously is said in your direction, even if it's said as a kind of a joke, even if it's said from a distance, rather than somebody putting you up against a wall, tying you to a chair and shouting abuse at you, however, in whatever form it came, that individual has a right to feel the impact of that. So we don't dispute that. Simultaneously, a 13 or a 14-year-old has the right to be an idiot at school, because that sometimes goes with the territory. It doesn't in any way justify anything, but it absolutely explains everything. And of course, if we don't follow that, what we're essentially suggesting is that no kid, no young teenager can ever learn from their mistakes, and they shall be tarred and marred with those mistakes for the rest of time. I think we can all agree that would also be silly. So Nigel Farage said a couple of weeks ago, he denies these very specific remarks, as I understand it, but he'd said, I probably said some stuff in the playground, whatever. And he did come back with a fairly good, I thought, his response that, well, hang on, this was the 1970s. And in that era, he listed things that were on TV, things the BBC were showing at the same time that Nigel Farage was alleged to have said similar things in a playground. And that's a really powerful kind of example, an equivalence that he was drawing between the kind of things that were said then and the sort of things that would never be said now. I mean, to talk about the black and white minstrels, it ain't half hot, mum, till death us do part. God knows how many other questions. The P word, the P word was in Only Fools and Horses. In the 1980s, it was used. I mean, the list goes on. So it's really a debate about offence as well. But it's also a debate about context, about time, as in an era, and about age. I don't think we can remove that from this. That doesn't justify anything that might have been said, but it does explain it. So I'd like your opinion on what's your view on what somebody, if somebody was a bully at school, let's just take the specific, just a bully, not in any certain, not to do with any certain theme or attribute of somebody's characteristics or nationality or religion, just a bully. Are we saying that a school bully remains a school bully for the rest of time? And they shall be forever marked out as that? Are they not able to say, God, I was a right arse when I was at school. I was horrible to some kids. And I don't know why. It was obviously some kind of insecurity or whatever the hell it was. I was rotten to, poor little Graham in year 8 or something of that nature. So do we therefore have to suggest that that person can never concede to that, never apologise? And there's the problem. So we have that to deal with. 0344 499 1000. You might have been that kid in the playground that got some very specific kind of insults hurled at you. And I don't dispute that can still hurt now if you think about it too much. But simultaneously, you might have been the child that was dishing it out and went on to be a fine, upstanding human being. But there's also the BBC aspect of this. When a BBC interviewer asks the deputy leader of a major political party, let's talk about Mr. Farage's relationship with Hitler when he was younger. I mean, that is editorialising an interview. That, I think, probably breaches the BBC's own. I was trying to remember what the code is in this respect. I think it crosses a line. Of course, people at the BBC will defend it and go, no, it doesn't. I mean, she could have said, let's talk about Mr. Farage's alleged remarks about Hitler. And that would have been within context. Let's talk about Mr. Farage's relationship with Hitler. That's a whole different ballgame territory, right? Does the BBC have questions to answer? 0344 499 1000. Let's get a word on this from Henry Hill, Deputy Editor at Conservative Home. Henry, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian.
Nice to have you with us. It's a contentious one, this, on a number of levels. Let's remind ourselves again of what the interviewer on Radio 4 asked Richard Tice when talking about this.
Let's talk about your leader, Nigel Farage's relationship when he was younger with Hitler, shall we? Because 20 people told The Guardian... 20 people told The Guardian that Nigel Farage behaved in a racist and anti-Semitic way.
Well, that's what Emma Barnett asked Richard Tice, and of course this boiled over to a press conference the following afternoon where Mr Farage called the line of questioning despicable and denied ever acting with any sort of racist intent.
I'm sick to death of the double standards and hypocrisy, above all, of your organisation, and what happened on the Today programme this morning was a complete bloody disgrace. Next, Sam Coates from Sky News. No, I'm done with you, thank you. Until you apologise for all of your output, your appalling output, at the same time that I'm accused of saying these things which I deny, I'm not speaking to you. All right?
So that all kicked off yesterday, Henry. Do we blame the BBC, do we blame Emma Barnett, or do we blame nobody at all?
So it's really an indicator, just another sign of the really difficult position that the BBC is in as a state-funded broadcaster with all sorts of advantages over private media, because from a purely sort of gotcha journalistic perspective, it's a fairly good way to ask the question if you're looking to get the stiletto in under the ribs of your opponent and get a sort of surprise response. But the BBC is a state-funded organiser, and as you say, you can imagine, and you indeed spelled out, the sort of Reithian way in which you would approach this question. It would be dry, it would be slightly boring perhaps, but you'd say, well, your leader's alleged comments about da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But if you want to go for the shock stuff, that's really what the private media is for, because the BBC is paid for out of everyone's taxes, and so that does impose restraints on it. So it was a good journalistic question for a private media show, but I don't think one for the BBC.
And it was clearly mischievous, right? I mean, I don't think anyone can deny that. It was asked. I can imagine Emma Barnett sitting there and preparing it and writing it specifically in this way. It didn't come off the top of her head. No, and that, mischief has its place in journalism, right? Correct. In the right place.
Yeah, exactly. If you're interviewing somebody, actually, especially these days when politicians tend to be so drilled and prepped and formulaic in response to interviews, a little bit of mischief is often what you need to knock them off their script a bit and get a good answer. So again, absolutely no problem with the question in general, but the BBC is the state-funded broadcaster, and you can see why Reform UK would respond as it has. There's already this siege mentality on the part of Reform. They've been alleging that the Labour government has delayed all of these local elections specifically because Reform was going to win them. And this is just going to be another brick in that wall. And I think that that's a real shame. I am sort of broadly a defender of the BBC. I think it's an important institution. It has a lot of problems, but Reform is still first place in the polls, right? And there's really no reason to think that it's not going to be a big part, at least, of the British right for the foreseeable future. And what you don't want is that party absolutely despising an institution like the BBC, which is extremely vulnerable to any government deciding to change how it's funded.
When it comes to the question that she asked, is that if we were going to point a finger, and we both agreed that, Henry, that it probably does cross a line because it's the BBC, do we blame the BBC or do we blame the individual journalist?
Well,
are they inextricably linked?
I mean, so I guess forensically determining that would depend on knowing things about how that show is put together that I don't know. Because did she sign off her line of questioning with her editor in advance? Is this a question, was this brought up in the editorial meeting for the show? If so, the BBC has an element of corporate responsibility for that. If not, and this is simply something that she decided to do, then it's harder to blame the BBC for that because, of course, this was, as I understand, live radio.
Yeah.
And you can't, if your presenter decides to go off script for whatever reason, it's one of the perils of live broadcasting. I don't even know if the BBC have that they probably have that 5-second delay in case something absolutely horrifying happens, but this wasn't that. And so, yeah, unless it was signed off by her editors, I think that this would not really be a BBC problem.
I mean, ordinarily, in that scenario, the editor would arguably have, or the producer would have arguably written the question. Now, Emma Barnett, fairly autonomous character, on any other day, a very diligent journalist, she would be within her rights to put in her own question as well. So whether she phrased it in a specific way, I guess we will never know the answer to that. I don't imagine in the Radio 4 newsroom right now they're particularly perturbed that they crossed any kind of line. But the more I think about it, and having worked there, albeit for about half an hour, I'm pretty convinced it does cross a BBC line. It's editorialising a question. There's no objectivity in that question. It's clearly loaded in all manner of ways. But we'll see how it pans out. I'd like to hear more from the BBC on this. Henry, stay with us. More stories still to come. Henry Hill is Deputy Editor at Conservative Home. We'll come to him.